only way or the best way of doing evaluation? And the answer is, it depends. So let me go on. So let me give you some examples. Conditional cash transfers in Mexico originally during the Progressive program. Some villages got conditional cash transfers, some did not. And there were better average outcomes. The conditional cash transfer was the family got some money, but instead of it being you just got the money, you only got the money if your kid went to the clinic and was checked and got their shots, or the kid went to school, or whatever the nature of the program was. This meant that in this evaluation, there was better average outcomes for the treatment villages, and the random selection means it must have been the conditional cash transfer, not something else, because there wasn't anything else going on. So let me take that as given, though in fact, well, let me take that as given. The question is, what do we learn? So there's the immediate question is, what, the fact that it worked in Mexico, does that tell us that it would work in India? Well, there's obviously a big number of steps. And that's what is often described as the problem of external validity. But there's also the question of whether it would actually work for a specific village in Mexico. So we know it worked for the average village in Mexico, but it certainly didn't work for all the villages. Now, would it work for some particular village you're interested in? So for instance, if the village were voting on whether to have conditional cash transfers, should the village vote to do so based on this result? That's not clear either. How about the question of why did it work? And if we knew why it worked, what was it that made it work, we could probably answer the first two questions. Another peculiar thing about Progressa was that the villages that didn't get the treatment knew they were going to get it 2 years later. So that's a very special sort of control group. And it's not necessarily the same as having it or not having it. Does that matter? Another thing that's a big important thing, and I'll come back to this over and over again, is Mexico had a system of clinics. So the clinics were there if the parents wanted to take their kids to the clinics. Now, you'll laugh at me when I say this, but it's actually really important. If you've given people conditional cash transfers and there were no clinics, the program couldn't possibly have worked, right? So there's a crucial ingredient in this trial, which is that the clinics were there. Now, Santiago Levy, who played a big part in Progressa in Mexico and is now at the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, says that he spends much of his life today fighting off countries that want to copy the Progressive scheme because he knows it's not going to work there because there are no clinics or because there aren't the schools or something. And yet, we're in a world in which rigorous analysis has shown that conditional cash transfers work. So that result gets transplanted into some sort of magic mantra, which is supposed to apply everywhere. And of course it doesn't, because there's an obvious thing missing in some countries, which is like clinics. So you've got to ask yourself, are these things transferable? What about dams? Well, it's not really possible to do randomized dam construction. So you can actually amuse yourself when you're trying to fall asleep at night by thinking about randomly constructing dams all over India. You drop a pin on Google Maps and you build a dam there, and then you see, well, of course you wouldn't, but that makes an important point, which is there's lots of important policy questions that cannot be evaluated in this way. So if you stick to RCTs, there's whole areas of policy, not just dams, macroeconomic policy, and so on, which we just really don't have anything to say by using these methods. Some have argued that policy should not be implemented in those cases, which is an extreme prescription. And in fact, if you think about that, we do many things routinely for which there have been no randomized controlled trials. You sometimes, the people who advocate these things very rigorously say, knowledge is not possible without randomized controlled trials. You sort of wonder how they get out of bed in the morning. They say, you say to your spouse, could you do a randomized controlled trial to make sure that toilets are working in the bathroom? Anyway, you can see there's a lot of things we know. We take aspirins all the time. There have never been a randomized controlled trials for aspirin. I have an artificial hip. There's never been a randomized controlled trial for an artificial hip. There's just a huge number of things which we depend on that have never been evaluated this way. So there are other ways of doing this. Rahimi Pandey and Esther Duflo have a paper on dams, which use the placement of dams together with NSS data. Dean Spears, who I talked about earlier, has worked on the total sanitation campaign using the NFH and other survey data. And these alternative methods also estimate average treatment effects, and they're what are called observational studies, and they're weaker than randomized controlled trials in some respects, because after all, there's now no guarantee of causality. You have to worry about selection and bias and all the usual sort of things, so you have to argue those. And you know, it's sometimes hard to persuade people, and of course you have to make more assumptions. But there are other respects in which they're stronger, which is you can look at the distribution of treatment effects. You can recognize the fact that different dams might have different effects, and you can model that and look at it. Usually, these methods use very big national surveys, or they often do, as opposed to the very small samples that are often in trials. With different surveys, you can triangulate some question and get similar or different answers. And RCTs are very good at saying what happened, but they're not very good at saying why it happened. And these other methods often offer possibilities for inquiring into why things happen. Let me talk a little bit about small randomized controlled trials. A lot of these trials are done on very small samples. So there may be 10 villages in the controls and 10 villages in the experimentals. These trials are expensive to do, so this is not just a matter that is easily fixed. And I don't want to get technical here, but there's some deep statistical problems involved in comparing the means when you're using quite small samples. And what really happens here is that if you have individuals in your trial for whom the treatment effects are unusually large, then they can wreak havoc with your results. One example might be in microfinance. I mean, I was talking about this with Rahimi Pandey the other night, and she said, well, often in these microfinance cases, what happens is there are one or two women in the group who are actually very talented entrepreneurially. So when they get the money, they'll do amazing things with it. But for most people, you know, it's all they can do to pay the money back, sort of idea. So if you get one of these really talented women in your experimental group, it'll look like this thing's doing incredibly well. If on the other hand, that same woman is in the treatment group, it'll look like this thing is doing very badly. And it turns out you need very, very bad, very, very large samples to make that problem go away. And so what happens with a lot of these randomized controlled trials where you've only got maybe 100 people or 100 villages, it turns out not to be nearly enough. You get lots of weird and counterintuitive results. You've no idea if this is real or whether the method is just broken. And I doubt very much that you can learn anything from a trial that has like 10 experimental and 10 controlled villages, for instance, in a cashing out food experiments. Another point that's often missed is the experiment is often, indeed I'd almost always say always, conducted, it's telling me that Windows is not genuine. You know, yeah, I see is buying cheap software. It's about a fake here. I'm genuine.
This is just an RCT going on.
Just an RCT. Good. If a big notice comes up over my head saying Angus Deaton is not genuine, all right, so let's say that you were doing an experiment on a conditional cash transfer. Then you want to recruit people to be in this experiment and find out whether they would like to have their PDS cashed out for cash. You can only do this on people who agree to be in the trial. People who decide in advance they don't want anything to do with this are not in your trial. So immediately you're doing this experiment. Before you randomize, you've got a non-representative group. And that's true for nearly all trials, because you can't force people to be in trials. Occasionally you can. You can put something in the water supply or something, but usually you have to get people's permission to be in these trials. And that selects into people, and sometimes quite severely. So the people you're doing the experiment on may not be anything like the whole population. So if you do an experiment on cash transfers, and it works, it may be just because the people who agreed to play this game with you are people who think cash transfers might be a good idea. But when you actually put them into place for policy, you bring in the whole population, including people who hate this idea, and you're going to get a very different outcome. This turns out in drugs, this is really a big problem too. In the US, pharmaceuticals are tried out in randomized controlled trials, and you're typically not allowed in the trial if you've got a comorbidity, meaning there's more than one thing wrong with you at a time. Almost all older people have comorbidities. And so drug trials in the United States have very, very few old people in the trials. But nearly all drugs are consumed by old people. So you've just got this ridiculous situation that you're doing randomized controlled trials on people who are never going to consume those drugs. And it's just nuts. And a lot of people are beginning to get worried about that. The problem with this gold standard rhetoric is that if you really think RCTs are automatically best, then people don't challenge